Well, it's nice to be here. For those of you who don't know me, and I recognize some people on this presentation, so I appreciate you all joining this afternoon over the lunch hour. For those who don't know me, I am Todd Arnedt. I'm a professor of psychiatry and neurology here in the medical school. I also direct our behavioral sleep medicine program, which is one of the specialty clinics and programs within our sleep medicine program. So we see patients who primarily have insomnia, but also frequently have circadian rhythm disruptions. And I'm a clinical psychologist by training, so we use psychological and behavioral strategies to manage their sleep difficulties. And then along with my colleague, Dr. Helen Burgess, who's a phenomenal circadian researcher, I co-direct our Sleep and Circadian Research Laboratory, where we're interested in the role of sleep and circadian rhythms broadly speaking, in mental health disorders, and my area of specialty is in substance use disorders. So I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about, to share our experience with testing and implementing telemedicine-delivered insomnia therapies. I've also decided to expand the presentation to talk about issues and considerations with implementing digital insomnia therapy, since they're now really being widely used in randomized controlled trials. And then at the end, I'll be curious to hear others' experiences with implementing these various technologies into their own research. So here are my conflicts of interest just to start out. None is relevant to what I'm going to be discussing today. So I want to start by setting the stage for sort of how we got here, talking about e-health, what I'll call e-health applications for insomnia research. There have now literally been hundreds of randomized controlled trials evaluating the efficacy of CBT for insomnia in people both with and without comorbid health conditions. So among those with no significant health conditions, you can see here on the left, this is a meta-analysis of more than 15 studies that indicated that cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia relative to control conditions improved. In this case, we're looking at sleep efficiency percentage, which is a measure of how solid somebody's sleep is. So people who got CBT had an on average pooled estimate of 10% improvement in sleep efficiency compared to those who got the control condition. And then among people with other health conditions here on the right, you can see this is, again, a meta-analysis of more than 20 studies, or about 20 studies, evaluating CBT in people with insomnia and a variety of other health comorbidities like alcohol use disorder, COPD, depression, etc. And they found that the odds, as you can see, of remitting from insomnia was more than 3 times higher for individuals who got CBT relative to those who got a control condition. So at post-treatment, CBT has consistently been found in multiple randomized controlled trials to be significantly more effective than control conditions, with effect sizes on important sleep parameters varying in the moderate to high range, moderate to large range, I should say. So in addition, there have been a number, not a handful at least, of head-to-head comparisons directly comparing CBT for insomnia to prescription medications in the same study. This is one of the seminal studies that looked at older adults, 46 older adults who had chronic insomnia, and they were randomized to 6 weeks of CBT for insomnia, or to zopiclone, which is a benzodiazepine receptor agonist, kind of a cousin of azopiclone. It's not available in the United States, or placebo for 6 weeks. And you can see from the figure that people who are randomized to the CBT condition showed a greater improvement. Here we're looking at total wake time. This would be subjective total wake time across the night. And those who were randomized to CBT at post-treatment showed a bigger improvement in total wake time compared to those who were randomized to placebo and those randomized to the zopiclone condition. Additionally, at the 6-month follow-up, you can see that the gains that were evidenced at post-treatment of the CBT group were sustained, and they were significantly better than the individuals who got zopiclone. So these findings from this one study are consistent with the few other head-to-head studies that have been conducted in the literature. And finally, in addition to demonstrating post-treatment efficacy and safety, the gains made during treatment, as I just showed you, have been shown to be consistently sustained when people get CBT, when they're followed up at various different time intervals or follow-up time points. So here again, you're looking at one of the seminal studies in the literature. That this one looked at older adults, more than 75 people with chronic insomnia who got 8 sessions of individual CBT for insomnia, or they got a medication for 8 weeks. The medication in this study was temazepam, so benzodiazepine, temazepam. And the graph shows the percent change from pre-treatment on these various subjective sleep parameters at the 24-month follow-up time point. This was the farthest follow-up time point. And as you can see from the graph, for all three of these outcomes, the group that got CBT for insomnia initially was more improved at this 24-month follow-up compared to those who got the medication only. So these and several other long-term studies support the long-term benefits of CBT, and in those that have used medications, also relative to medications, better sustained gains for CBT. So as a result of this robust literature indicating short and long-term efficacy for CBT, it's really become the first-line evidence-based treatment for chronic insomnia. And here you're looking at two practice guidelines from leading professional organizations. We've got the American College of Physicians here on the left. This is the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, most recent clinical practice guidelines on the right. And in both cases, you can see that these professional societies recommended cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia as the initial treatment for chronic insomnia disorder, both with a strong recommendation based on the evidence. So given these considerations, really the focus over the past 15 to 20 years now has turned to really identifying and evaluating different formats for disseminating this effective treatment. So CBT for insomnia is now available in multiple self-help formats, ranging from various self-help books on the market to e-health formats like what we'll talk about today, telemedicine, or the main focus of today would be telemedicine, and then digital-based CBT for insomnia interventions. So with this background and context, I want to highlight a study that we were fortunate enough to get funded on. And in 2016, so we're going back, this is pre-Zoom, pre-telemedicine, really in the early infancy of telemedicine. The nonprofit arm of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, at that time called the American Sleep Medicine Foundation, issued an RFA, and they were looking for applications that specifically focused on the role of telehealth and telemedicine. And here they were interested in their own proprietary telemedicine platform, which was called AASM SleepTM at the time. And they were interested in its performance in the evaluation and management of patients with various sleep disorders. And one of their specific areas of focus was comparative effectiveness studies comparing this telemedicine platform to usual care. So we responded to this RFA, and we were fortunate enough to get funded back some years now, a few years ago now, to conduct a non-inferiority trial of telemedicine delivered versus face-to-face CBT for insomnia. And this study we conducted had three specific aims. The first aim was to compare the efficacy of that telemedicine platform, AASM SleepTM, and face-to-face CBT for insomnia on sleep and insomnia and daytime symptoms in adults with chronic insomnia in a non-inferiority trial. Our second aim, this was partly driven by the fact that telemedicine was again relatively in its infancy at the time, was to compare the credibility of and patient satisfaction with CBT-TM and the CBT face-to-face, so the telemedicine platform and the face-to-face platform. And then our final aim, which I won't really focus on today, was to conduct a cost-effectiveness analysis of the two platforms, two delivery systems. So just quickly, our eligibility criteria, we recruited most participants actually from our insomnia clinics here at Michigan Medicine, but also to some degree from the community. Individuals who participated needed to be adults. They had to score 11 or higher on the Insomnia Severity Index, consistent with a chronic insomnia disorder. And they had to evidence subjectively reported insomnia on baseline sleep-wake diaries, kind of a standard protocol we use for kind of confirming subjective reports of insomnia. The exclusion criteria you can see here, so people were excluded if we had a suspicion of, or they had another kind of sleep disorder that wasn't adequately treated. We eliminated people who had certain Axis 1 mental health disorders, including bipolar disorder, psychotic disorder, active substance use disorder. People who had unstable chronic medical conditions that were related specifically to the insomnia, routine overnight shift work, and then a previous failed trial of CBT for insomnia. Here you can see the study design we used. Again, this was a randomized controlled non-inferiority trial of 6 weeks of CBT for insomnia that was delivered via telemedicine or face-to-face to 65 adults with chronic insomnia. Relatively simple. After eligibility criteria were met, people completed baseline questionnaires. They were then randomized in a 1-to-1 ratio to one of the two formats, face-to-face or telemedicine. The treatment was then delivered over 6 consecutive sessions, actually in this case by the same therapist who delivered it in both formats, exactly the same content across both formats. At post-treatment, they completed the same self-report scales they had done at baseline. And then we had a 12-week follow-up. This table here summarizes the main outcomes for the study. Our primary non-inferiority outcome was the Insomnia Severity Index, but we also looked at other sleep outcomes via the daily sleep-wake diary, and then we also used actigraphy in this study. Daytime symptom measures included a fatigue scale, which was the multidisciplinary fatigue inventory, the PHQ-9 to measure depression symptoms, the GAD-7 to measure anxiety symptoms, and then the quality of life SF-12. And then we measured treatment satisfaction and cost effectiveness with the 8-item client satisfaction questionnaire, the therapy evaluation questionnaire, and then select items from the National Health Interview Survey to look at cost effectiveness. So before I talk about the results, here were some of the initial questions and concerns our study team had when we were discussing and thinking about this study. And you have to view these issues through, I think, an historical lens, because again, we're much more knowledgeable, obviously, about telemedicine now than we were back then. This was very much pre-Zoom. And so the issues that we had, I think, were relatively reasonable at the time. And the first issue we had was how much functionality would we use in the particular system that we were looking at. So again, we were evaluating this AASM SleepTM system, and it had a variety of different functionalities. Not only could you obviously use it to deliver the intervention, but it allowed for a variety of sharing of different documents. It had a scheduling system in it. And so we had to figure out what we were going to do in terms of allowing certain functionalities or not allowing certain functionalities as we examined it. And we decided to use it very simply and basically just to deliver the intervention. We thought that was probably the most replicable across different sites for people who would use this, that was the most fundamental thing people would be using it for. So we just used that only functionality within the system. A second concern or question we had was we wondered if older individuals would be less likely to participate in the study because they didn't have a computer, or they were less likely to have Wi-Fi access or lower e-health literacy. And so we actually developed kind of an enhanced training in anticipation of that for those individuals who were less familiar with using computers, felt less comfortable with them. And we also purchased some cameras for people who didn't have cameras with their computer, but who were actually assigned to the telemedicine condition to have those resources on hand for those individuals. And our final question that we wondered about again was, would participants be less satisfied with and feel less connected to the therapist with telemedicine delivery? And that happened to be one of the study questions that we obviously addressed, and we have some data on that I'll show you. So here's the consort flow diagram. You can see here we initially screened 450 participants for the study. We ended up randomizing 65 of them after they went through a variety of different screenings. We allocated 33 to the CBT telemedicine condition, and we allocated 32 to the face-to-face condition. We had good retention in this study. We had 62 people who made it through all the way to the 12-week follow-up. So really, at the end of the day, only lost data on 3 individuals. So good retention in this randomized controlled trial. And then briefly, here are the results for the non-inferiority question, which was our primary question, and our main outcome was, again, the Insomnia Severity Index. And so as you can see from the graph, we found that after adjusting for confounders, we found that telemedicine delivered CBT for insomnia was not inferior to face-to-face CBT for insomnia at both post-treatment and follow-up. So just looking at the numbers here, this is in the moderate to severe range for insomnia on average at baseline in both groups. And at post-treatment and even at follow-up, they're in the range where you can see the line here that we draw for insomnia remission. If you're at 7 or less at the end of treatment, you're considered to be in remission from clinically significant insomnia. And you can see that both groups almost achieved that as their average and sustained it at that 12-week follow-up. We also looked at categorical remission, and we found that 50% of people were in remission for the face-to-face group, 42% for the telemedicine group, and the odds of being in remission were not different between the two formats, the two treatment formats. And then we did superiority analyses to look at our daytime symptoms and patient satisfaction measures. And we didn't find any differences between the conditions of any of our daytime symptom measures. But in all cases, the daytime symptoms improved from pre to post treatment in both conditions. So here I've plotted depression symptoms just out of interest, one of our daytime symptom outcomes. And for these, you can see that people started in the mild to moderate range, and they dropped down to almost a mild range on average. And again, the gains were sustained in both groups at that 12-week follow-up. In terms of satisfaction ratings, you can see again that participants in both groups were highly satisfied on this client satisfaction questionnaire, which ranges from 8 to 32. They were highly satisfied with both of the formats that treatment was delivered in overall. And again, no significant difference between the groups. And then finally, we looked at therapy process measures between telemedicine and the face-to-face delivery formats. And here we actually hypothesized that people would again would feel to some degree more connected with their therapist when they underwent face-to-face as compared to telemedicine. But perhaps somewhat surprisingly, we actually found no difference. So the therapy evaluation questionnaire has two questions that people complete at the end of therapy. So how warm and caring did you find your therapist? And then how confident are you in your therapist's skills? And you could see numerically that the face-to-face group did a little bit better than telemedicine, but this wasn't significantly different. And the work alliance inventories is a self-report measure we had people complete at the end of each treatment session. And that looks at perceived rapport between the participant and the therapist. And again, we didn't find a significant difference. Again, somewhat surprisingly, we thought between the telemedicine and face-to-face conditions on the total score for this measure, or on the three subscales that you're looking at here: bond, goal, and task. Another interesting finding we thought was that despite covering the same content, the only thing that differed in this was which format you were randomized to. You were randomized either to the face-to-face or the telemedicine format, but the content was exactly the same that was delivered. But we found that, in fact, we were somewhat more efficient, if you want to call it that, at delivering the therapy via telemedicine, where on average, the sessions were about 10% shorter for the telemedicine condition compared to the face-to-face condition. And here we speculated that this higher efficiency might have been due to the tendency for less kind of what I think of as small talk in that setting, in the telemedicine setting. Or perhaps alternatively, we thought that people who were coming face-to-face because they were sort of more used to that, maybe more, on average, more comfortable with that, they tended to be a little more talkative in that particular setting. But nevertheless, we did find that we were 10 minutes or so more efficient on average for our telemedicine condition. And this, of course, could have implications in terms of cost savings, for example. So what were some of the lessons we learned from this particular non-inferiority trial comparing this AASM SleepTM telemedicine system to our typical face-to-face, our gold standard face-to-face delivery? Well, the first thing we learned was that telemedicine was feasible for delivering these evidence-based psychological treatments. It was certainly feasible among this population, and we found that treatment satisfaction and engagement in the telemedicine was equally high as it was with face-to-face. In fact, anecdotally, we worried that participants would be concerned about telemedicine and would prefer to be randomized to face-to-face. But anecdotally, we talked to lots of participants who were secretly hoping that they would be randomized to telemedicine rather than in person. Even though they hadn't had a lot of experience with it, they appreciated the convenience of the modality, not having to figure out commuting, parking, childcare, etc. And we, in fact, found that cancellation rates and no-show rates were relatively low for this condition overall. And the final thing we found was that telemedicine may be a more efficient and cost-effective means of delivering the intervention. We certainly found it was shorter. We haven't quite analyzed all of the cost data yet, but it certainly could theoretically be a cost savings relative to face-to-face. So of course, there are advantages for telemedicine relative to face-to-face that we have leveraged in the context of our clinical trials. So you can, of course, potentially recruit more diverse and more representative, theoretically, a national sample for many of your research studies. In fact, we've undertaken such a national sampling to some degree to our own detriment as we're now trying to scramble to keep up with things for one of our ongoing trials, because we can, all of our outcomes, our main outcomes anyway, are self-report, and we can deliver the therapy totally via telemedicine. And so we've expanded to national recruitment. I think there are also some advantages from the therapy delivery standpoint for telemedicine, especially as it comes to delivering a sleep therapy. So you can actually get a glimpse into people's environment. And you could, for example, look at people's sleep environment and give them personalized kinds of recommendations for how to adjust that to improve their sleep quality, perhaps. And when it's difficult maybe to build rapport in the context of telemedicine, having a view of somebody's environment, maybe a pet in the environment or something, can help give you information and fodder for maybe fostering that relationship a little bit better. And then finally, in the context of telemedicine, it can be easier to collect information on medications, for example. People can get up and just go get medications, or they can show you things that they're actually using that are sitting on their bedside table, or you can collect information easily from other informants who might be present. But then there are, of course, disadvantages to using telemedicine. And I think for those of us who do this work clinically and have fallen into delivering a lot of clinical care via telemedicine, we're well aware of these things. There are, of course, connectivity issues that can be a huge challenge when you're trying to deliver therapy. It can really eat up a lot of the time trying to navigate connectivity issues. And then people can get distracted by what's going on in their environment, and oftentimes they can multitask. So I think just like we do in the clinical context, in the research context, it can be often helpful to set expectations with patients at the beginning of delivering these therapies in a research setting around what your expectations are for their behavior, so that they can be present and engaged for the entire session. But alas, our study was not all for naught, but because it looked at an AASM SleepTM service, we later learned that, perhaps not surprisingly, the AASM decided to discontinue their SleepTM telemedicine service in 2022. And that is, of course, because Zoom came along, became a monopoly, and could provide all the functionality that the AASM SleepTM system was providing without the cost for many providers. And so while it didn't negate certainly the results of our non-inferiority trial, it does, I think, segue me into discussing what I think are some of the important considerations when thinking about implementing these e-health interventions into your own research, into research studies. So I want to cover just 5 topics here that I think are important issues and considerations when implementing e-health interventions into research, into clinical trials. So the first is, which e-health platform should you use? I think that's an important question. I want to talk briefly about the efficacy across different therapy modalities and the impact that can have on your research. Talk a little bit about engagement with digital interventions in particular. I told you that the engagement we found with telemedicine was high. I want to talk about engagement with digital interventions. And then how to integrate these e-health technologies into kind of the research setting, so you evaluate them, and then end with some kind of budgetary considerations for including these e-health technologies in research protocols. So let's start with which e-health platform. In the context, in the insomnia space, for insomnia randomized controlled trials, there are really 2 main players. Sleepio is one of the players, made by Big Health, it's owned by Big Health. And Somryst is the other big player, which is now, more recently, as of the last year, maybe even the last 6 months, owned by Knox Health. So these are the 2 big players on the market. And there are at least several dozen randomized controlled trials involving one of these particular products. And many of these studies have relatively large sample sizes, relatively diverse samples. Many have been published in high impact journals. Both of these products were developed in consultation with leading insomnia researchers in the field, and both really deliver high quality, evidence-based treatment components in fully automated systems. So those are a lot of advantages to using one of these two platforms, digital platforms, in the context of your research studies. But I think there are downsides also to these two platforms in particular. And I think one of the major downsides is neither is commercially available. And if you, to the extent that you want to select an e-health platform that has a probability of high uptake, that's something that you need to think about with these two platforms in particular. SleepTM is available, at least as far as I'm aware, only through the National Health Service over in the UK, or through specific employer benefit plans. And Somryst is actually FDA approved, and it was available briefly via prescription when it was owned by its previous company called Pear Therapeutics. But now it's unclear what the business model will look like now that it's now owned by Knox Health, and neither is really available, at least in a usable form, and can download it on either the App Store or the Google Play stores. So I think that's a limitation to using one of these two. Now it's possible down the road they could hurdle these barriers and it wouldn't be an issue. But as you think about which e-health platform to choose, I think that's a downside of these two, is that neither is commercially available. This table shows a subset of other, this is not exhaustive, but it does show a subset of other available online CBT for insomnia platforms with a brief description of each and then the price of each. You can see the price varies from free to $549. Looks like it's the highest, at least for these ones. So wide variety and cost. Again, in thinking about which e-health platform to choose, cost is an important consideration, as is the likelihood of reimbursement perhaps down the road, maybe another consideration in how to choose one. In contrast to the two platforms I just showed you that are widely used, this one, CBT-I Coach, you can see down here at the bottom, and its sort of cousin, which is called Insomnia Coach. Now, CBT-I Coach is not really a fully automated platform. It's really meant to be used in collaboration with a therapist, but those are widely in use, at least in the insomnia field, and they're freely available. And so it might have some advantages over, for example, SleepTM or Somryst. Whatever the choice of platform, I think you'll need to justify that choice to reviewers of your grant. So the more systematic you can be about how you've selected a specific e-health platform, the better. And I think no matter what the choice, it's important to have an alternate modality option for participants who, again, don't have reliable access to Wi-Fi, who maybe don't have a computer. As I mentioned, for our telemedicine study, we purchased cameras to make available to participants who didn't have them. You could make those resources available, or you must have at least some kind of alternate modality that people can use so that they can participate even if they don't have Wi-Fi access or a computer, for example. One possible strategy for being systematic about how to decide which e-health platform to use is to look in the literature. And this is a study I found in kind of culling the literature that rated 53 commercially available mobile health apps that targeted insomnia and rated them using a validated scale across 4 dimensions: engagement, functionality, aesthetics, and then information, and rated them across these 4 dimensions. So this is one metric, for example, you could use to help you select an appropriate e-health platform. But no matter what you choose, it's probably likely that it will be more beneficial to you to build a relationship with the prospective company in the space or the platform or the product that you want to use. And it's important to recognize entering these relationships that the motivations are different from the research perspective relative to the company's perspective. So the company's primary motivation is really to sell their product. And as you approach these companies, I think it's important to recognize that fundamentally and to try to frame your questions and your requests with this in mind, and to work collaboratively with them so they can get something of value out of the relationship. So a win-win, or as Michael Scott might say, a win-win-win kind of situation is ideal for having good relationships with these particular companies. You want to clearly define and identify the type of arrangement that you're going to enter. Are they donating the product for you? Are there folks on their team that are going to collaborate on the project with you? And it's also important to recognize that this relationship may evolve, is likely to evolve over time. And to demonstrate that, I reached out to one of my colleagues, a good friend of mine, who has had a longstanding relationship with one of the providers, so one of a company that they have published with for more than 10 years. And the relationship has really evolved over the course of those 10 years as the company has grown, changed in terms of leadership, changed in terms of focus. And so just to give you an example of what that looks like in practice, this research group had been publishing with this company for the past 10 years. And when they started out, it was a very much a collaborative relationship where they would be offered very low cost to no cost codes to allow their participants to access this particular platform. They collaborated with them on data sharing. They collaborated with them on publications. And it's now evolved to more recently, as you can see from some of these emails I've got up here on the screen, email exchanges, to the company really dictating the terms by which they would allow their product to be used in research studies. And so you can see a few examples here where the company has written back. This is an exchange from the company to the researcher. And you can see they've said here, we're interested in a general patient population with X rather than with those with Y, as results may be more applicable to the wider population. So indicating that they wouldn't allow their product to be used if this specific population that the investigator wanted to study was going to be studied. They also made suggestions about the research design, clearly something that's outside of their realm of expertise. So they said, we suggest modifying the trial design and population to a more sequential trial to reflect the clinical decision-making process for X patients in Y care settings. And down here, they said, at this time, we're not supportive of using the focus groups to investigate X engagement or satisfaction. So you can see that this relationship has evolved from one that was highly collaborative to one in which it's obviously not as collaborative, and the company is protective of its own IP and really dictating the terms, as I said, under which they will allow their product to be used in the research setting. So I think a lesson here is that even if you approach and have a relationship with a company, which is advisable to optimize your research, it's good to diversify these relationships. And ideal not to have a relationship with a single company, but perhaps with multiple companies in order to protect your own research and your own interests. A second issue, I think, with using these e-health platforms is that effect sizes, they vary across the various modalities. So here, as you can see from the results of this recent meta-analysis from 2023 that evaluated more than 4,500 studies, 44 studies, more than 4,500 participants, the effect sizes across the different self-help deliveries are highly variable. And if you look at telehealth, you can see that the effect size is about the same as face-to-face. But if you look at internet CBT for insomnia or digital CBT for insomnia, you can see that whether it's in an unguided format, so that would be totally fully automated like Sleepio, like Somryst, or whether it's guided internet delivered CBT, the effect sizes are lower than for face-to-face. It's presumed the format it's presumably replacing. And they fall in the kind of moderately high effect size range. And so it's important to recognize that as you make these adjustments while there are obviously benefits to going to, for example, a digital form of therapy in terms of the reach of the therapy, you do potentially lose some efficacy. And that's important to remember and important to address in the context of a research proposal. Now, I showed you earlier some data that suggests that telemedicine delivered CBT is non-inferior, at least as far as insomnia symptoms, to gold standard face-to-face CBT. There's another study by Phil Garman, my colleague Phil Garman, that had similar findings. So that suggests that telemedicine is a reasonable substitute for face-to-face with respect to efficacy. But I think it's important to note that these were both relatively small studies, not very representative studies. And so we can't say that with absolute clarity. We need more diverse samples, but at least the effect sizes to date have shown to be about the same as face-to-face. But on the other hand, there's been evidence that digital CBT is actually inferior to face-to-face CBT with respect to efficacy. And here, this was a study you can see of more than 100 individuals with chronic insomnia disorder who were randomized to digital CBT. In this case, it was shut-eye, which is the same program. It's now called Somryst, or face-to-face CBT. And you can see, it's a little hard to see, but you can see at the post-treatment week 9 assessment, the digital CBT was actually inferior to face-to-face CBT. And in week 33, it wasn't necessarily, but it was inconclusive here. Now, digital CBT alone is inferior to face-to-face, but there's good data to suggest that actually clinician support may actually enhance the digital CBT outcome. So this is a study from 2013 that randomized people to digital CBT for insomnia with or without support. And support here came in the form of weekly emails that motivated and reminded participants what they should be doing, gave them some personalized guidance. And the support here was human-based, but you could certainly envision support that could be a virtual assistant now or AI-based assistant. But you can see in terms of outcomes that in terms of sleep efficiency, and again, the insomnia severity index, the group that got the support had better outcomes in both cases than those who were just randomized to CBT without that personalized clinician support. So if you choose a digital CBT-I platform, because it may be inferior to face-to-face, I think you need to provide a strong rationale, not just for the type of platform you choose, but also for whether clinician support will be provided. And here you need to weigh the pros and cons of including clinician support, which of course be more costly. So it may be a budget, there may be budgetary constraints to think about, but you also may be thinking about the specific aims and scope of the project in making these particular decisions, but sort of a nuance with dealing with digital CBT that I think is important in the context of in the insomnia space anyway, to address in the context of research proposals. Another consideration with e-health therapies is that there's some evidence suggesting that engagement may be an issue. And engagement's important because engagement relates to treatment outcomes. And I think this study is a particularly good example of the impact of engagement on outcomes. This was a study that looked at the effects of a culturally tailored internet-delivered CBT. Again, the internet-delivered CBT used here was that shut-eye product, or Somryst. And the culturally tailored version involved a 1-year adaptation of shut-eye with different stakeholders. So they had Black patients in this case. They had physicians with who had primarily patients from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds. And the adaptations to the shut-eye program included substituting visual content to include only Black men and women, the introduction of didactic content that was relevant to Black participants. And then once they adapted this and developed this culturally tailored shut-eye, they randomized more than 300 women to this culturally tailored shut-eye, to regular shut-eye, or to patient education. And they assessed their outcomes at 9 weeks and then at 6-month follow-up. The main outcome, the insomnia severity index, improved in both the shut-eye groups relative to the education condition. However, a higher percentage of this group, these participants who were randomized to the culturally tailored version of the intervention, a higher percentage of those individuals, as you can see, completed treatment compared to those who were randomized to the regular shut-eye. And this was relevant because those who completed treatment did better overall compared to those who didn't complete treatment in terms of the insomnia severity index, in terms of wakefulness after sleep onset. So wake during the night was more improved in those who completed the full treatment. In terms of sleep efficiency, that is, again, solidness of sleep, and then in terms of another sleep disturbance outcome. So it was important that people completed here to have good outcomes, and those who participated in the culturally tailored were more likely to complete. So it suggests that it's important to consider strategies really for enhancing engagement to the extent that you use these particular technologies in the context of your research. And a related issue to engagement, and really to me, some of the manifestations of disengagement with some of these technologies, is participant dropout and then treatment adherence. And there's several studies that indicate, again, in the insomnia world, that dropout rates are elevated for digital therapies relative to face-to-face. One meta-analysis, for example, suggested dropout on average of 25% for digital CBT compared to around 10% or less for face-to-face trials of CBT for insomnia. And in this meta-analysis, as you can see, if you just focus on the treatment adherence section, they found an average adherence of 52% as measured by a self-report and measured by logs, 2 different measures of treatment adherence. And so again, treatment adherence is relevant because it relates to engagement, which is related to the effect size of your particular outcome. So two messages here I think are relevant related to engagement. So first, I think it's critically important to measure adherence to e-health interventions in the context of this kind of research. Common strategies for doing this include self-report measures, asking people how much they adhere to various aspects of the treatment components, but also things in the context of digital delivered therapy as logins, the number of completed modules, for example, the number of visits to a page, etc. But critically important to collect this information. Some of this may be available from the service provider, and it's important up front to determine what may be available and what may be shared with you, as opposed to what you may have to collect on your own in order to meet this need. And then I think the second message as far as engagement goes is that investigators who conduct these kinds of studies need to build in an infrastructure for managing lower engagement with digital therapies in particular. So this could mean identifying study team members who are explicitly tasked with following up on participants who aren't following the protocol, etc. One approach that has been shown to help engagement in other settings, not in the context of insomnia, but is something like gamification. And that I think needs to be something that's evaluated in insomnia research. But strategies for improving engagement is something that's important to think about in conducting these types of studies. And the final sort of scientific issue I want to touch on is relates to how to integrate e-health technologies and clinician-led therapies into research in order ideally to optimize their effectiveness, their availability, and ultimately the future uptake. And so I think several ongoing studies really follow, at least again in the insomnia space, follow this step care model. This is the most common design that is in which these technologies are used. So that is maximally available and accessible, and efficacious treatment is administered as a first stage of treatment. And then non-responders to that first stage are, quote, stepped up to a more resource-intensive stage if they don't respond at this particular first stage. So in the context, again, of insomnia, it might involve offering a digital therapy as a first stage, and then stepping up non-responders to, as you can see here, a small group of manualized CBT delivered by trained therapists, perhaps now delivered via telemedicine, for example. And then non-responders to that would step up to the next stage. I think this is the most common design that's used to evaluate these digital therapies. But there's another approach, and that's to create a blended care or a blended therapy experience where digital therapies and clinician-led therapies are integrated and combined into a single treatment experience. So an example of how this might work might be that more information-based material in a particular intervention could be presented digitally. If I think about CBT for insomnia, these would be things like education about the sleep system or the main model of insomnia that we usually teach people, or sleep hygiene related things that are more just sort of didactic and more informational. These could be delivered electronically or digitally. And then intervention components that really require more rationale, more personalization, perhaps more motivational encouragement. These could be clinician-led. So again, in the context of CBT for insomnia, here we think about the behavioral strategies such as sleep restriction and stimulus control, where really you need buy-in from patients in order to have good adherence and therefore good outcomes. This latter model of a blended care approach is where you're integrating the e-health approach with clinician-led. These have not been as widely tested to my knowledge generally, but certainly not in the insomnia setting. And I think they potentially could have some advantages in terms of efficiency and cost savings. And then finally, let me end with some budgetary considerations for engaging in this type of research. And I put up here the budgetary allowances that were given to us for receiving the award from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine Foundation I talked about earlier. You can see that it was made known that people who were applying for this particular, in response to this RFA, could get up to 3 personalized demonstrations and training sessions for the investigator and or for the study team. They got custom reports for study patient data. And finally, they were allowed to waive the basic annual contract fee for the duration of the study. So this is what we knew going in we were able to receive. But I think there are several potential line items that you want to think about if you're engaging in this type of research. And I've listed some of them here. So You want to think about startup costs for training. It might include training with the actual digital platform you'll need, plus perhaps a certain number of calls per year to troubleshoot issues that might be written in, or service contracts in particular. It's important to try to think about ideally one line item that covers, quote, patient costs. And this would be all the services, this would include all the services you need from a particular company. So it could be things like, in the case of Sleepio, they typically have codes for participants to allow them to access the actual platform. And then platform metrics you may need from the company that you may use to indicate engagement, for example, or actual data, outcome data you may need. All of this might be rolled into a line item called patient costs. And you need to have a plan in place for dealing with the transfer of information from the company to the research team, as an explicit example. You might have a consultant or co-I from the company that's included in your budget. And it's always good to include the letter from the chief scientific officer for that particular company. And then, as I mentioned, we did for the telemedicine study, again, we purchased a number of cameras that people could use. So you may want to purchase hardware for those individuals. I mean, one potential solution for people who don't have access to Wi-Fi or to computers would be to loan them some sort of hardware that they could get the e-health intervention on. That's a potential solution. So you may have a line item related to that. And then I've already alluded to this. It's critically important to have an infrastructure to support the e-health system. And this typically comes in the form of personnel. So this would be potentially an RA who is, quote, a champion user, who is the go-to person when there are initial technical issues, can resolve many of those, can provide training to participants, help out the research team. And then they may be tasked, as I mentioned, with focusing on engagement by participants and reaching out to those who are missing their sessions, for example, and trying and strategies for increasing engagement. So those are some of the, I think, the potential line items that need to be included in a budget related to this kind of research. And in an ideal setting, you don't rely on the company for any of your research data. They're not doing anything research-wise. In the ideal world, the company provides the product that delivers the treatment in the case of the digital therapy, or it's the vehicle by which you're delivering the treatment in the case of telemedicine. But you want to have a good conversation initially and determine up front if you need any data that they don't have readily available, so you know what you need to collect on your own. I'm thinking about adherence data here in particular. You want to know what you need to collect on your own. And in particular, you need to have all of the privacy and data collection protection procedures buttoned down, understood with the digital products in order to get approval from the IRB and other institutional regulators. So what's the encryption approach? What are the data sharing policies by the company? And in the case of collaborations with some of the digital companies, you can have, for example, this information outlined on an opt-in page that participants would come to initially for the first session of their treatment in the case of digital of a digital intervention, where they would come to and explain all of these policies and procedures, and participants would opt in at the start of therapy in order to agree to have their data accessed in one way or another. So let me end with some take-home messages here. So first, I would say that e-health delivery of psychological treatments is feasible, it's effective, and it certainly increases access to evidence-based treatments. The selection of a specific platform is really driven by scientific, logistical, and often practical considerations. Establishing a relationship with one of the service providers can enhance the research, your own research, but I think it's important as much as you can, as I mentioned, to align motivations and to diversify relationships in case you have issues that come up, and to protect your own research program. And finally, e-health research projects really require specific budgetary considerations in order to be successful. And just before I leave, I want to acknowledge both my co-investigators and research staff, and of course the funding source for the study that I spoke about a little bit earlier. So I think I've left a few minutes for questions and comments, and happy to have that discussion now.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I took a ton of notes, and in the agenda, which I'll share in the chat, I put a couple of articles that we have in our knowledge base, and one video that might be helpful for folks to get a little bit more information or a different perspective related to some of the things you brought. But I'm going to open it up to questions from others.
I guess I have a question. Do you have any kind of what future studies do you have planned? And you know, based off of the studies that you've done, what would you like apply from your knowledge learned from those studies that you've already done?
Yeah, good question. So we've used telemedicine pretty much since we did that study. We have implemented it for all of the randomized controlled trials that I've done to date, and we've been able to leverage that pilot data of the non-inferiority study in our grant applications to make the case that it's a viable alternative to face-to-face. And as I mentioned, we have an ongoing trial now that recruitment has lagged as it does, unfortunately, in so many randomized controlled trials. So we're now doing national recruitment, and we've had, Zoom has made life easy for people doing telemedicine because so many people know it. It's free for those of us in academic institutions to use. I would imagine if you're out in private practice, you've got to build that into your budget, but in our setting, we can use it free in our research studies. So it's made it, and people are familiar with it. It's made it easy. Like I struggle a little bit on Teams sometimes. So how do I share my screen? So people are familiar with how to use Zoom, and I think that's made it really easy to use. And so we've used it in all of our studies, and we have a grant in now that's not telemedicine related because it just isn't, that's not the focus, but we've had good success with it in implementing it in our various randomized control trials. And this is often in difficult populations. We don't do kids, so I don't have any knowledge in how it would work with younger populations, but we've used it in relatively difficult populations and generally had good success with it.
Thank you.
I had a question, if that's okay. And thanks, Todd. It was a brilliant talk and full of pearls, which I've been noting down for my studies. But I wanted to ask about when you were comparing in-person versus telemedicine delivered CBT-I, and particularly around, I guess, the sleep restriction therapy component. Do you think that actually having face-to-face is more supportive, or do you think you're seeing comparable effects for that particular component of the intervention?
Well, that's a good question. I think, I do feel strongly that intervention needs a lot of prep work and a lot of hand-holding by the therapist to have it executed by the participant in a way that's successful. I deliver most of my therapy now clinically via telemedicine and deliver that all the time. And I can't say I've seen systematic differences in terms of what the outcomes look like. I will say that I think there are some things you don't want to necessarily do on telemedicine without, or certainly on digital therapies. I have some concerns with doing some things like weaning people off medications where there's not necessarily clinical backup. I think that those are things you've got to be careful of, and you probably have to be in fully automated protocols more careful with delivering sleep restriction in terms of the minimum amount of time in bed that you're recommending, because there's just you're less hands-on. So I think that you have to be more cautious there. But telemedicine, I think it's more like face-to-face, and we do seem to develop pretty good rapport for the most part with people. And so I think you don't see a lot of difference, at least systematically, in terms of how much success people have with that particular procedure.
One really quick follow-up question. I did see that one of your exclusion criteria were suspicion of a comorbid unmanaged sleep disorder. I'm just thinking, if someone had sleep apnea, they're on CPAP, it's managed, would you allow them in your insomnia studies?
Yeah, and we did for that, and we went to probably overboard to make sure that people were adherent with the treatment, like we would download adherence things. But that's one of the downsides you know, you lose anytime you're increasing external validity by reaching out and being more diverse, you lose some internal validity. And one of the things on the sleep side you lose is you can't bring people into the lab who live in Kentucky or North Carolina to do in-lab sleep studies like you might in most randomized controlled sleep trials to rule out sleep disordered breathing. So you have to think about being more rigid around other metrics that you might have available that are self-report. So, you know, we have kind of more rigid guidelines for allowing people in who are collected, but that's another downside of doing remote kinds of teletherapy. You do lose some internal validity.
Thank you very much.
We are at time. There's one more question in the chat. If you have time, I'd be happy to ask that. And then we understand if people have to jump off. The question in the chat is, are there any plans to tailor the digital CBT to meet the needs of individuals with other psychiatric or neurodevelopment diagnoses, such as bipolar, substance use, autism, ADHD?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Thanks for that question. That's a good question. So we have done some adaptation with people with substance use disorders. The trials I have ongoing now are in people with substance use disorders. I don't know about bipolar disorder in terms of, I've not seen anything in the literature using adapted kinds of e-health interventions for that group in particular. But my guess is that as this becomes increasingly more popular, we're going to see more of those kinds of adaptations for those special populations. But again, because you don't have hands-on, as I mentioned with Daniel's question, for some of the, especially the digitally delivered, I think you've got to be more careful with implementing some things that you would do routinely in face-to-face or even telemedicine kinds of interventions once it's a kind of a fully automated digital things. Like the one that makes me the most nervous is weaning people off, messing around with medications, broadly speaking, and you know, weaning people off medicines without guidance. Like I think you have to be very careful about that. So, but good question.